Hi, and thank you for joining me for another short talk. And today, friends, I want to discuss the calendar of Enoch. Now, I really do not intend to offend people with this talk, and I'm saying this because there are good and admirable people who I respect who hold this belief, so I hope they do not take this as an attack. To start off, what is the Book of Enoch? And friends, I'm sure you probably have never heard it mentioned in this manner, but it's ultimately a book of many combined midrashim and agadot, which also appear in rabbinic literature, in the Talmud, Midrash Rabbah, Ein Yaakov. Now, in the non-Jewish world, words like apocrypha and pseudepigrapha and deuterocanonical are used to describe such works, but in the Jewish world, all this is lumped up into Agadah, i.e. folklore and legend, always understood as things that are outside of Torah, that can neither add nor take from it, but can, in many cases, enlighten the reader with Torah concepts, and also in other cases could achieve the opposite. Now, it's always been a principle that books outside of Torah cannot in any way modify Torah or our understanding in a foreign way. And I know that if you look at Orthodoxy today, that principle is not always adhered to. And people usually come to this belief or this calendar of Enoch as the best or the proper way to determine calendrical cycles and years, typically came to their belief in Torah with the understanding that books like the prophets and the writings are on the same level as Torah, almost like progressive revelation to Israel, which makes them think that because we have accepted other books as divine other than Torah, who's to say that we cannot lump in these apocryphal books as well, which is how Karaites and Messianics relate to our Bible. And this is why it's specifically Karaites and Messianics who have adopted the Book of Enoch as inspired for themselves or their congregations, which would make sense why it would be individuals from these movements that you would find picking and choosing what they consider authoritative for themselves, ultimately because they have come from belief systems that had to undermine Torah and how it functioned in order to exist. In other words, Karaite Judaism or Messianic Judaism could never have taken off if the idea of a consensus ever entered their theology. Now, what is the calendar of Enoch? Well, this calendar is one which claims to go solely by the sun, unlike the currently understood Jewish calendar that goes both by the moon for months and the sun for years, and even stars to determine days. And I know that this already may sound a bit complicated for many, but take my word for it, it's not. Now, although it is simple to imagine, it is a little difficult to explain without charts. So I'm going to try my best to explain it in a manner that everyone listening could understand. Friends, let me ask you, how many days does a complete solar year have, scientifically? In other words, how many days does it take for the Earth to completely revolve around the sun? And the answer is 365.25 days, or 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 46 seconds. Now, this is something we've known for over 2,500 years, right? It's nothing new. However, you must know that the Book of Enoch claims that it's 364 days. How did it come up to 364? Well, it seems by just multiplying 7 days by 52 weeks, but this still leaves us short of the 365.25. Because one of the claims made by those who have adopted this calendar is that it just makes so much sense and that the rabbinic/biblical one didn't. Now, there is a difference between the calendar we go by today in the Orthodox world and the one we believe they went by in Tanakh and in Second Temple times. In other words, our belief, and what I'm going to demonstrate by quoting Scripture, was the practice of all of Israel to spot months using the moon and ultimately determine years using the sun. Now, this whole procedure is detailed both in rabbinic literature as well as in Josephus. However, after the destruction of the Second Temple, when Israel not only lost their temple, but even their national identity, the judges, the court, the Sanhedrin, the ones who initially instituted the calendrical system that appears in Tanakh, decided, because of the exile, to reinstitute a calculated calendar, which was used during the first exile. And this is the calendar we go by today, till there's another temple, there's another court, and ultimately religious Jewish sovereignty in the land. In other words, although there are certain hints in Tanakh that we should go by some sort of lunar system, it never gave specifics on how to do so. Rather, it left it up to the elders to come up with a system, which again is a system used by anyone who either accepts that Israel went by a lunar system at one time or still goes by the system today. But regardless, the system is that months are determined by moons. And like we said, years are ultimately determined by the sun. In other words, witnesses would spot the sliver of the new moon and announce it to the court. And after an interrogation was done by the court to determine the sighting's validity, the announcement was made throughout Israel that there was a new month. The problem is that this method only gave you a calendar which consisted of 354 days, i.e. a lunar calendar, lacking the 365.25 days of a solar calendar that you will need to have certain holidays land within certain seasons, because there is a Torah law which indicates that the month of Nisan, including the Passover, must land in the spring. So, what would happen if Israel only kept a fully lunar calendar of 354 days? Simple. Every holiday could and would land in every season, which is what we see with Islam today, that Ramadan could just as well land in the winter as it could eventually land in the summer or spring. So what was Israel's solution, or specifically the solution of the elders, the court, the Sanhedrin? Because again, it was left up to the court, as the Torah tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 17, that Israel was bound to listen to this court and not to stray from the right or left of what they rule, and that by disobeying them, they would be disobeying God. But anyways, the court instituted a leap year system that every few years they would introduce an additional month, the 2nd of Adar, to calibrate the calendar, i.e. for Pesach to always land in the spring. Now remember, there was nothing within Torah that contradicted this system, mainly because the Torah never told you how months or even years were to be determined. And outside what is written in Torah, only the court had the authority to make such a decision. Nor did it ever tell you that you needed to have 12 months in a year. Now, although the Torah never specifically told us how to determine months or years, it did give us many hints that it was the moon which would determine months, and even though it never told us how to start counting or how the moon was to be spotted, it did give the elders, the court, men with smicha, authority to determine such issues. And this touches on what I think is the main argument made by the proponents of a solar versus lunar calendar, to the point that they go as far as calling it God's calendar or creation's calendar versus man's calendar. And the main proof they try to bring is that Tanakh never links the moon with months or something resembling a calendrical system, which then leaves them to theorize that it was possibly the solar Enoch calendar that was being used by the Israelites. And honestly, this really was news to me, mainly because anyone who's ever read Tanakh in Hebrew would realize that this wasn't the case. I mean, Tanakh does link the month with the moon. And yes, I know that Chodesh does not mean moon, but renewal of a sequential part of a year. No, friends. The word we're looking for, or root word, is Yud Resh Chet, Yoreach or Yerach. And even excluding the famous pasuk in Tehillim in Psalm 149, verse 9, that states that God appointed the moon for Moadim. I mean, that's super clear. But even in Torah itself, in Exodus chapter 2, verse 2, it states, and the woman conceived, speaking of Yocheved, and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him for 3 months. Again, Yerachim, 3 moons. Or Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 13. And she shall put the remnant of her captivity from off her, and shall remain in thine house, and bewail her father and her mother for a full month. The word used is Yerach, i.e. a full moon. Or in the rest of Nach, outside of Torah, in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 37. In the 4th year was the foundation of the house of the Lord laid, in the month of Ziv, Yerach, the moon of the month called Ziv. Get it? Now, I'm sure you know that Torah did not name all the months, and the namings that we have for many of the months follow the Babylonian names, but in Solomon's time, they followed the names most popularly used in that region. But even the next verse, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 38, it says, and in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, the moon of Bul, which is the 8th month. And friends, this is one of the verses that seals the deal, because it reads, and in the 11th year in the month, Yerach Bul, which is the what? It says, Hu HaChodesh HaShemini, which is the 8th month. In other words, you have the word Yerach and the word Chodesh, meaning the same here. In other words, this is the key needed to know that Chodesh means Yereach or Yerach. It doesn't get any clearer than this. But there's more. 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 2, and all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto King Solomon at the feast in the month of Etanim. Again, month, Yerach, which is the 7th month. Again, making the link between Chodesh and Yereach or Yerach, moon, month and moon, ultimately renewal and moon. Next, 2 Kings chapter 15 verse 13. Shallum the son of Yabesh began to reign in the 9th and 13th year of Uzziah king of Judah, and he reigned a full month in Samaria. Yerach, moon. Job 3 verse 6. And for that night let darkness seize upon it, let it not be joined unto the days of the year, let it not come into the number of the months. Yerachim. So here you have year and you have months, or the sequential portions of a year, referred to as Yerachim, moons. Next, Job chapter 7 verse 3. So am I made to possess months, moons, Yerachim of vanity. Or Job chapter 29 verse 2. Oh, that I were as in the months past, the moons, again, Yerachim, past, as in the days when God preserved me. Job 39 verse 2. Canst thou number the months? Again, moons, Yerachim, that they fulfill, or knowest thou the time when they bring forth? Zechariah chapter 11 verse 8. 3 shepherds also I cut off in 1 month. Again, Yerach. Now, friends, after hearing all this, why would you think that Israel did not go by the moon? And a better question, is there at least one verse anywhere in Tanakh that would make one think that they went solely by the sun? I mean, just any pasuk. Not to mention that Enoch 74 states that the 364 system is an exact, precise system. Exactly precise. Look, I understand that going solely by the moon is not too efficient when one could go by the solar calendar, which clearly places you closer to an actual year. And actually, by going only by the solar method, it still doesn't place you precisely in the following year either. I mean, even in the U.S., with the way we currently calculate the year, which is by the 365-day method, leap years still need to be added. And it's the same for the Enoch system. Days have to be added to match the 365.25 days needed for a full Earth's rotation. Not to mention that there is no consensus on how to make up those extra days. In other words, everyone does what they want there also. And even regarding the Qumran community, who people theorize kept a similar calendar, we have no proof that they intercalculated days to keep Pesach falling in the spring. In other words, with what we know of the Qumran community, they could have just as easy been keeping Pesach in the winter, because that's what would occur if one only went by a 364-day calendar, without intercalculating days. And again, we also have no references in the book of Enoch or Jubilees how to add these days. So, what are we dealing with here? Friends, I think this is a case of the best being the enemy of the good, because at least with the court's methodology on counting and the few hints in Torah, we could, as Jews today, say that we have a complete documented system. I mean, can you imagine how Israel could have survived till now with everyone calculating their solar calendrical system with no consensus? To the point that even the Samaritans till today still go by a lunar calendar. So here I think that this, outside of anything else, really shows how there had to be a consensus on how the ceremonial was to be kept in Torah and amongst Israel. Because here we have people going by a completely different calendar, celebrating every holiday on a different day, of course excluding Shabbat. I mean, being religious in a secular world is hard enough. I mean, try doing it alone, because that will ultimately be your outcome if you try to live by such a system. And For some reason, those who adhere to the Enoch system pass a video around of a secular Israeli professor, Rachel Elior, speaking on a topic she ultimately knows little about. I mean, here you have a secular Israeli speaking on a religious topic to other secular Jews. In other words, in her talk, she claims that the Torah is a forgery, i.e. not written by Moses, but the book of Enoch and Jubilees is to be trusted as authentic. Secular Jews do this all the time. It's called creative writing and speaking. Now, for those in the non-Jewish world, this is equivalent to American professors of theology in universities trying to tell you what they think the Bible is saying. And I've debated many, and friends, it's a joke. Not failing to mention that in the second book of Enoch, the system even contradicts itself and says that the calendar is 365 days, not 364. But to those who follow the first book of Enoch, the second they consider a forgery. Even when the first book says that the sun is the same size as the earth. Again, friends, all this when a system was already in place using moons for months according to Scripture and how to determine months, including leap years instituted by the court. So this is just another attempt to disorganize religion and religious people from uniting. And one problem is, friends, is that those trying to disprove the traditional system are really not familiar with the system they're trying to replace enough to adopt a different system that is also full of holes. Because again, there is no perfect system. In other words, there's no way to fit 365.25 days into any calendar without making huge adjustments. And I think what attracts people to this method is that it allows and empowers them to determine the months and feasts on their own, making a system which was only understood by those who knew how to read Hebrew and had access to rabbinic writings accessible to anyone. Even though they virtually all celebrated the holidays on different days, again, because there wasn't a consensus on how to add the additional days needed to complete a full cycle every few years. Even with incorporating the use of the vernal equinox to determine the exact moment of spring, which is something not mentioned in the Qumran writings nor explicitly in the books of Enoch or Jubilees. To the point that we do know that the priests in the temples also used the vernal equinox to determine exact spring. And this even appears in rabbinic literature that developed the practice of spotting the moon, and ultimately the lunar calendar. In other words, the priests had methods for spotting the vernal equinox even back then, because that was the only way to find out when to institute leap years. Not to mention all the verses we just showed confirming that moon and month in Hebrew are used interchangeably in Tanakh. Friends, what more proof do you need? I mean, are you beginning to see that the Book of Enoch system is not as precise as you may have thought it was? Not to mention all the verses we just showed confirming that moon and month in Hebrew are used interchangeably. In other words, there are many who feel that they have discovered a new accurate system in the books of Enoch and Jubilees and the community at Qumran. But it's mainly because the other system was completely, in many cases, unknown to them. So friends, what's the outcome? Look, if all the Pasukim we quoted didn't make the case, and the lack of consensus on how to execute a supposed precise calendar doesn't make it either, and the disorder and isolation that living by such a calendar would create, friends, if you're still not convinced that the traditional understood method is better, not perfect, but a seemingly overall better method, with all the reasons we've just described, again, with the exception of the fact that you merely have to add less days with the solar calendar than you do with a lunar one, then friends, I don't think that anything will convince you. Friends, for more information about everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.com. Thank you.